Regina, I've got to rip up the script here and take it from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to your visit in recent days to the United Arab Emirates. We spoke to the head of their energy policy who stayed on script. I need you to get off script. What is the power of the Persian Gulf to affect global price and diminish Mr. Biden's efforts to lower price?
The OPEC plus producing nations definitely have the power to lower prices right now. I was struck by that, the confirmation that there is spare capacity in both Saudi and the UAE. But there is a sticking to the script that all of them are focused on. They have an agreement. That agreement has been in place, and they're sticking to the agreement. And then I think that gives a little bit of a buffer from some of the external pressures that might be facing them. And then when you ask each of them independently, right, so the UAE will say, well, we're just 10%. Right. And there is an agreement. So I was not surprised by what came out of today's 12-minute meeting.
Take us from Doha to a Bloomberg Surveillance conversation with the Secretary of Energy a number of months ago. And the point of the argument was the one price of oil. Is that true that Mr. Biden and the four salt caverns have to deal with a global oil price, or can they manage a U.S. price?
Well, I think that the challenge for the U.S. administration is that gasoline prices more closely correlate to the global oil price, which is tied more to Brent versus WTI. So while we do have abundant U.S. supply, which we still have a challenge of getting out of the ground, labor shortages, costs, et cetera, but the price of gasoline pivots more closely with the price of Brent, and that's where OPEC Plus and some of the other suppliers come into play.
Regina, we're looking at this oil reserve release, potentially, as reported by Bloomberg, that could amount to 180 million barrels in sum after all of the months are added up. How much does this actually reduce the strength of the U.S., basically diminishing the reserves and actually propping up prices even further later when they try to rebuild them?
Great question, but if you believe some of the other analysts, like Secretary Muniz that was referenced earlier, there is a belief that toward the end of the year, supply markets will balance. So if there's an opportunity to diminish some of OPEC's influence in the short term and ease prices at the pump for consumers, then that's the wise decision to take right now. I worry less about what it does to our defense ability in the future and the cost exposure, because I do think oil markets are poised to settle down in 2022, 2023.
Regina, to double down on that point that Ernest Muniz and you echo that we're going to have more of a balancing in the rest of the year. What does that assume? The end of what's going on in Eastern Europe, the bringing back on some of the Russian barrels, or other sources as production increases in the U.S.?
All of the above. Plus, I think the one thing, Lisa, that maybe you left out is that the current price is an incentive to non-OPEC producers. So a lot of plays are in the money, and I think people will do what they absolutely possibly can to bring more of those supplies to the market so they can monetize. Think Canadian oil sands, think investments in Mexico. So there are other sources of supply, Guyana and the find that we have there, that I do believe will come into the market, and that's what folks are counting on to help ease the supply crunch.
Regina, can you just clarify something for me quickly? What is the SPR for? And is this the right way to use it?
Well, I actually don't feel qualified to comment on that, Jonathan, because I think it's a lot about our defense of our country. Fuel is a really important commodity. I grew up in Hawaii, and I remember the 70s sitting in the backseat of my parents' car for hours on end on an odd or even license day, waiting to be able to fuel up our tank of gas, so that we could drive around a small island. So I think that's what it's intended to try to buffer, and that we could, gosh forbid, that there would be a large conflict. We have those supplies, and I think it's pretty important.